Hi, everybody. Welcome. Very happy to be with you today. So excited that May Center's Open Door Fund has reached our goal, and we are now in a bonus round. So I want to thank everyone from the bottom of my heart for giving. Your gifts mean so much to us. They will allow us to serve more kids and through our scholarship fund and through our outreach work. So thank you, thank you. We hope to get to our new bonus goal of 130,000 thanks to our generous board member, Jacqueline Leibowitz, who has generously put up our bonus round match. So there is still time to give. Please help us reach that goal of 130,000. I'm very glad to be here today to talk to you guys about a topic that is particularly near and dear to my heart, which is the importance of early intervention for kids who have learning differences. I think in education in the past, there was a paradigm that really promoted waiting and seeing. And of course, we recognize that all children develop at their own pace. We recognize that every individual is unique and that each child is going to reach those milestones in their own time. But we also know that there's a window of typical development for kids. And if a child is starting to demonstrate signs that they are not developing within that typical window, all of the research demonstrates that the earlier that we provide first identification to be able to really understand how this child is processing, how their brain is processing language, is processing the world around them, and then appropriate intervention. We know that with those two things, all of the research demonstrates that kids do better. There are better outcomes for children the earlier that they receive appropriate identification and intervention. Um, I oftentimes talk to adults who went their whole lives without being identified, without knowing that they had a learning difference like dyslexia, without knowing that they were on the autism spectrum or that they had ADHD. And these adults tell stories about how difficult it was in school. They thought they were dumb. They thought they just weren't good at school. Many of them, in fact, dropped out of school. And these are adults who are incredibly intelligent, in some cases, incredibly successful in their field of choice. These are adults who are articulate, creative, and have so many strengths. But their self-concept, the picture, the story that they carried around about themselves was a negative one because they did not have the self-knowledge that identification and intervention provides. So one of our goals at May Center is to promote and to help families get the resources that will allow them to, first of all, understand their child better, and then second of all, to support the areas that their child needs support in while their child is still growing and developing. Um, so one of the things I want to share with you today is related to the identification of dyslexia. We used to believe that dyslexia was a learning difference that could not be identified until third grade or later. And the thinking behind this was that at third grade, most typical children have become fluent and automatic in their reading skills. Well, what we know, of course, is that by third grade, most children who are in fact dyslexic are several grade levels behind their peers. So they might be a third grader chronologically, but their reading and spelling and writing skills may be at the kindergarten or first grade level. So by that point, we already have 2 to 3 years worth of learning that a child has missed out on. We have all of that ground to make up, right? Whereas if we can identify a child before they fail If we can identify a child in kindergarten or first grade, what we know is that they have not yet experienced failure. They have not yet known what it feels like to sit in a classroom and look around at all the other kids and say, oh, that kid's reading, that kid's reading. What's wrong with me? Why am I not reading? And then to begin to tell themselves that story that they must be dumb, they must be stupid, they must be not good at school, right? All of those things that they surmise. And what's frightening is that, there's been many studies over the decades that shows that by first grade, kids already have a sense in their class of who are the good readers, right? The good reading group, and who are the not so good readers. They know who those groups are, even if a teacher strives to not single kids out. Oftentimes, teachers have the best of intentions, but kids, especially smart kids, um, are able to surmise what's going on. And so we have really been advocating and supporting a universal dyslexia screening, which we're so happy was signed into law by Governor Lujan Grisham in April of 2019. So this screener is not a diagnostic test, and it's not designed to diagnose dyslexia, but it is designed to identify some cognitive patterns that are consistent with dyslexia, that give us a clue that this child in kindergarten or first grade might be at risk for developing dyslexia. And if we can identify that cognitive pattern early, what we have seen nationwide, because this is a trend that is really taking place nationwide, what we have seen nationwide is that there is a dramatic drop in the need for referrals to special education. Why? Because kids get the support that they need when they're young, before they fail, and they're able to go on and be successful in school. Because most dyslexic kids do not need to be in special education, but they do need a teacher who understands dyslexia, who knows what the characteristics of dyslexia are and what to look for, and who can use a screening tool to identify the areas that a child who is at risk for dyslexia may be struggling. So I'll talk a little bit about the characteristics of a screener and why they are important. And then we'll talk a little bit about what information should a parent be looking for? What are the signs that a child might be dyslexic? And then how can a teacher best support a dyslexic student in their classroom? So the difference between a dyslexia screener and another kind of reading achievement assessment is that a dyslexia screener is really identifying the pattern of cognitive processing in the dyslexic brain. Screeners are designed to be brief. Usually they take no more than 10 minutes to administer. They're ideally designed to be administered with one teacher and one student working together. And we're right now kind of experimenting with how does that work if we're in a remote setting, right? And what we're finding, what our diagnosticians are finding, is that a lot of it works just fine if you can be, as I am now, face to face with each other, right? That the child is able to see the teacher's face, see the teacher's mouth, and vice versa. So that's an interesting, field that's come into being just recently as a result of necessity. So they're designed to be brief. They're designed to identify certain features of the way that the brain is processing language. They're standardized and normed. And they are designed to be used in kindergarten and first grade. What's amazing about dyslexia now and the research around dyslexia is that so much of the characteristics of dyslexia can actually be identified way before a child ever learns to read. So that really has turned on its head this thought that we need to wait until third grade when a child has should have become fluent in reading. In fact, we can learn so much about even a preschooler's language processing by looking at what we call their phonological awareness. Their phonological awareness simply means their brain's ability to process the sounds of the language. And a good screener is going to give us a window into how the brain is processing the sounds of the language. So, some of the things that a good screener will do is it will look at whether a child can identify words that rhyme and can produce rhyme consistently. Rhyming is a language skill that relies heavily on the phonological processing part of the brain. And oftentimes, kids who are at risk for dyslexia struggle to hear when words rhyme and struggle to produce words that rhyme. So that's something simple parents can even do at home, playing rhyming games with your children and just watching for how their brain is processing language. Another thing we look for in young children who are just developing language, so even before kindergarten, we're really talking about starting at the age of 3, is does the child struggle with similar sounding words? Does the child mispronounce a lot of words? Oftentimes we hear kids, say things like Paschetti. Well, at a certain age, that's appropriate, right? Their brain is still figuring out the sounds of the language. But after a certain point, what we should see is that straightens itself out. The more that they hear someone else say the word, their brain retains that in their auditory memory, and they're able to replicate it with their own mouths and say it correctly. But dyslexic kids oftentimes are not able to do that. They will continue to hold on to mispronunciations. And in fact, I know one dyslexic adult who still says the word Pacific instead of the word specific. He does not hear the difference between those two words. So if you don't hear the difference between two words, you're not going to be able to spell the difference between the two words, and it's going to be difficult in reading to identify what the word is, and then what the correct meaning of that word is. So that's another thing we look for. Screeners also identify other characteristics of dyslexia. So they also look at, can a child identify the beginning sound of a word, right? So if I say the word bat, you tell me the first sound you hear. By kindergarten, most children can say B as the first sound. They don't have to be looking at the word. They don't have to be seeing the letter B. They can hear B as a discrete sound. Oftentimes, dyslexic kids struggle with that. They hear more of a glob of language, is what we think. So the word bat sounds like one sound to them, and it's hard to discriminate each of the individual sounds. So that's something a good screener will look for. Another interesting thing about screeners is that they often have what's called a rapid naming component. And this is very simply a piece of paper that either has colors, just colored dots, or for first graders might have the letters or numbers. And all we ask the child to do is just call the name of the color across the line, or the name of the letter, or the name of the numbers. What we find, and what Marianne Wolf has done a lot of work in this area, what Dr. Wolf has found is that dyslexic kids tend to have a smaller rapid naming speed, not smaller, slower, a slower rapid naming speed than typical kids. And so they might start out kind of strong and resemble a typical child, but perhaps by the end of the first line, or as they move to the second line, they may be really struggling down and calling and recalling that name of the color or the letter or the number takes them longer. Their brain is working more slowly to pull up that language concept that is associated with what they see on the page. Then a dyslexia screener will also look at things that are more typically associated with reading. They'll look at, does the child know the names of the letters and the sounds the letters make? Can they read basic age-appropriate words? Can they spell basic age-appropriate words? So these are all aspects of a good screener. I want to remind you that screening is different than diagnostic evaluation. So a screener is usually brief, whereas a diagnostic evaluation could take 2 days, sometimes 6 to 8 hours typically. A screener is brief. It doesn't really parse out the data. Usually there's a cutoff, and if a child scores below that cutoff, they are identified as at risk. Whereas a diagnostic evaluation is going to give us a full cognitive picture of how that child's brain is functioning, not just in these areas that are related to language. Um, the beauty of a screener is it can be administered by a teacher. You don't have to have a special training other than learning how to use the screener. You certainly don't have to have a license or a certification, whereas a full diagnostic evaluation can only be completed by someone who is licensed in the state to do those evaluations. And an evaluation is what is necessary to qualify a child for special education. So the focus of screening is really to identify those kids who might struggle to learn to read, and then to provide them with the appropriate intervention within the MLSS system, which is what our public education department calls the system of support that should be in place in every classroom. So in order for that to work well, we need teachers who are trained to teach reading, right? Who know how to teach reading, who are professionals, who have expertise in this area. And unfortunately, right now, most of our colleges and universities that train teachers, that give teachers teaching degrees, have not done a great job of teaching the science of reading, the brain science of reading. How do our brains learn to read? So we and others in our field feel it is so important that we really provide teachers with the professional knowledge and expertise so that they're empowered to teach every kid in their class. And so another aspect of effective intervention for dyslexic students is making sure that we have teachers in our elementary school classrooms, particularly in kindergarten, first and second grade, who understand how the brain learns to read and who really get how a high quality intervention program should work. So what are the elements of a high quality intervention program for dyslexia specifically? They include being very explicit in the teaching of the language patterns. They include being systematic and cumulative. And what I mean by that is that we really teach the most foundational skill first, and then we build on that knowledge with enough explicit practice that a student can reach what we call automaticity, so that they can become automatic with reading, with recognizing those words and calling them without that labor that you typically hear in a struggling reader, where they're still really laboring over sounding out each sound. And what we know is that if a child's at risk for dyslexia, they typically need a whole lot more repetition in those systematic and cumulative patterns than a typically developing reader. In fact, what Dr. Louisa Moats and others say through their research is that while a typical reader needs hundreds of repetitions of a concept, uh, a child who is dyslexic or at risk for dyslexia needs thousands of repetitions. And so, as you can imagine, sometimes in a general education first grade classroom, the instruction is moving too quickly for those children, and they are not able to integrate and become automatic with what they're learning. So it's extremely important for those kids that they have a specific intervention time where they're working on these skills. Another characteristic of a lot of dyslexia intervention is that the program should be multisensory in nature. What that means is that it is simultaneously activating the visual, the auditory, the kinesthetic, and the tactile. So kinesthetic is moving, and tactile is being able to feel. So in many Orton Gillingham-based dyslexia intervention programs, you'll see the use of some kind of sensory input, so that maybe it's a sand tray where the student is learning to write the letters with their finger. Maybe it's what we call a memory board, which is a piece of rough masonite where the child is writing. In our Montessori materials, we have sandpaper letters that give that child that tactile input. It could be shaving cream, it could be gel, it could be many, many things. But that tactile kinesthetic paired with the auditory and the visual has really been shown to create new neural pathways in the brain, to allow more of the brain to light up when a child is reading. And that is the ultimate goal. Now we can look at MRIs and we can see that when a child receives dyslexia intervention, uh, after, on average, about 2 years of intervention, so this certainly doesn't happen overnight, but their brain patterns, the way that their brain lights up when they are reading, begins to look more like a typical reader. Will never look exactly like a typical reader, but it absolutely begins to look more like one. And that's really the hard, concrete evidence, right? The scientific evidence that this intervention is working, which is real exciting for people who work in this field to see that. Um, so, what are the benefits of intervention? Well, the first, of course, is, as I just said, the development of academic skills so that as a child progresses in school, they are not behind their peers. Remember that kids who have learning differences like dyslexia are often average to above average intelligence. And in fact, many of the students we have at May Center would qualify as gifted in the public school setting. So they're gifted plus they have a learning difference. And we call that twice exceptional. And so for those children, intellectually, they can completely engage with the material in their age group classroom. But their language skills, their reading and writing skills, might lag significantly behind their peers. So by getting earlier intervention, they're able to keep up intellectually with their peers, which of course actually keeps them more interested and engaged in school for many reasons. First, school feels successful. Doesn't feel like a place that's unsuccessful that they dread going to every day. Second, they have a self concept that is positive. They see themselves as a successful learner, which is going to continue to motivate them as they get older. And third, they can engage fully with a curriculum that is intellectually exciting and stimulating for them. And they're not in a remedial track, which is perhaps doing its best to remediate the skills that are weak for them, but isn't feeding their intellectual curiosity. And oftentimes, what we see as kids get older is if they're not able to keep up with their peers in terms of their skills, they just become so bored and tuned out of school, right? And who blames them? Because there's nothing that's really interesting and stimulating about what they're doing every day. So, those are some real important benefits of early intervention. I've talked a lot about dyslexia, but of course, early intervention and identification is important for other learning differences as well. If a child has a sensory processing issue or is on the autism spectrum, it is equally important that they receive an appropriate diagnosis by a professional and that they start to receive interventions both for their fine and gross motor skills, which are often delayed, for their language skills, expressive and receptive language skills, which are often delayed, and also for their social skills, which is often an area that's difficult for a lot of children with sensory processing and autism issues. So those areas of intervention are oftentimes handled by different kinds of professionals. Um, Again, a diagnosis often comes from a neuropsychologist um, as a first step in figuring out, what is the processing pattern going on. But then you might have a team of people working to support that child, an occupational therapist, a speech language pathologist, a teacher, maybe a counselor, a team of support individuals who can help the child reach their potential and be successful in all ways. Because that's really the goal of early identification and intervention. It's to help all of us who love and care about this child, whether we're their parent or their teacher or another support professional. It's to help all of us do the very best job that we can to support this child. And it's ultimately allows the child to have the most success, to have the most growth, and to ultimately go as far as they can in their lives, which is the most important thing that we can do for our children. We can give them the confidence and the wings to fly. And that's really what early intervention is all about. So I thank you so much for joining me today for this conversation. I hope you found it useful. I want to remind you again that that for the next 2 hours until 3 o'clock, our Open Door campaign, which funds our scholarship and outreach programs, is going on. And I would encourage you to consider giving a gift that will provide this life-saving intervention for more children in New Mexico. Thanks for joining us. Bye.